Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Is the technology first, or when is the social first? And how do we actually deal with the social aspects and the way in which people and groups actually start to engage with technology? In human-computer interaction, a lot of the focus was on how a human will interact with a particular technology and the use that it will have to that person. Is it valuable? How, what are the future access, and once they use that technology, can they talk to other people about their use of that technology? When in fact, one of the things we're seeing with a lot of the more social technologies is that people are gathering with other people, and they happen to be mediating their interactions through technology. And they're less concerned about whether the technology works or how it works than they're concerned about the people around them. This is one of the reasons that some of the design features that we often talk about, the design might be abysmal, but if the people can do what they want, they will engage with it anyhow. I mean, as we joke around, Myspace is an atrocious design, right? Absolutely hideous. But for the people that are using it, it's key, because it's where their friends are. So when technologies are taking off and the people are actually engaging with it, you have to ask how engagement should happen. Big technology companies have liked to throw fire hoses at it. As a researcher at Yahoo, I get to see this all the time, right? If we just put it on the front page of Yahoo, everybody will come. And the question is, do you really want everybody there, and what are the costs of having everybody there at once? The alternative is something more like an organic growth. Organic growth was one of the things we've seen really take off with what is often called social software. Right? So Friendster and all of the social networking apps followed an organic growth model. And it kind of spirals and spirals and spirals. And the question is, what are the values of going in when you already know people that are using this community? And sure, you might interact with strangers, you might not, but you're going in with an already deep connection to the people. And sometimes this spirals even more ridiculously, right? Like, if you look, for example, what happened with Friendster, Friendster actually had a funny balance. For the first 300,000 users, it was completely organic. It wasn't until the Village Voice came out in June of 2003 that the media was actually paying attention to it, and it started to funnel a fire hose at it. What it meant is that starting in June of 2003, just as the organic growth was really taking off and people were really engaging with their friends, a whole flood of new people who were disconnected joined. They weren't part of the social rules, they weren't indoctrinated into the system, and they weren't quite sure how to actually participate and what was normal. So they actually engaged in behavior that was actually much more disruptive to the early community, because the early community had developed its social rules through the organic growth. With a lot of social technologies, number one thing that I hear over and over again when I ask people about why they do it is because my friends use it. And that's really funny, because if everybody says it's because my friends use it, a big research question is, who are those key people? Who are the people that are using it to start and the ones that are actually motivating their friends? The one danger that I'd like to say for some of this organic growth is a lot of things about echo chambers. And we see this particularly with politically minded social communities that grow organically. So, Clay and I have had conversations about sort of the problems with a lot of the Dean campaign and what it meant to go online and see the organic growth and see the energy and how exciting it was, and to find out that the energy was all the people that like you, and it didn't actually spread beyond the boundaries of the cluster that had joined. So I talk about this as sort of the cluster effects and how you have to deal with different versions. When you're trying to go and create a vibrant community, having that echo chamber can be very valuable. If your goal is actually to keep spreading, it can be very dangerous. So technology is the baseline. It doesn't make sociability. And one of the advantages that we've had is for the people who are doing internet research is that, there's questions of what it means to access the internet, right? So there's, questions of access to computer, there's questions of literacy, and in many ways, there's a large population that has baseline access to both of those. Whether or not they can actually communicate across different cultural boundaries, there's still tons of access issues. But by and large, we're actually, how many years into it, having some successes at doing it, which means we can actually create social experiments, and many of us in the room are in the process of doing so. We can create online communities and sort of see what happens. Mobile is a huge problem right now, and one of the main reasons that it's a problem is that the baseline isn't there. And the baseline isn't there not because people don't have have phones and they can't make phone calls, and we're starting to get a baseline for SMS. But most of the social experiments that we want to run require having these cluster effects. They require having a group of people with access to the same technology, with access to the same kinds of interaction paradigms. And the whole model, economic model, carrier model, is so devastatingly problematic that we're not even able to run our experiments. And so I think that one of the questions that we have as researchers is, when can we actually pose hypothetical ideas? And I see a lot of people in this room having designs or building out designs for mobile technologies, but when are we actually building it on the lack of a baseline, and what are the costs of that? So some of the major issues in innovation is that we have a few technology clusters actually in adoption. One of the most interesting there's pretty much 3 exceptions in the United States. The BlackBerry or CrackBerry, which seems to generate an entire population of business-minded folks. And so there's actually a possibility for business-minded design on the mobiles to occur. But most of the people who are using the BlackBerry at this point are so focused on email and very much deeply connected to their home machines. The Treo, which is sort of a lot of the social tech populations and some different sort of elite populations. And again, what they're doing is going back to the home computer. They're using the email. And the third, which is sort of an interesting thing to me, are the sidekick users. And the sidekick users are actually mostly urban street kids. And they're doing some really interesting things, playing with IM and sort of pushing what it means to do IM in mobile. The fact is, they're mostly working class, and most researchers and business folks are not actually paying any attention to them. So it's sort of an open area for research. I know a lot of people have been asking me about Myspace, so I figured I'd give a little bit. Why Myspace? Why teens? What's going on there? Those who've heard me talk here before have heard me talk about Friendster and the social network culture. And so Myspace came out of that. We all know that. But what is going on with Myspace that makes it fundamentally different? One of the things that was really powerful in getting people there is there was a really embedded design process. Anybody who's on Myspace knows who Tom is, right? Tom is this weird character who's your best friend and everybody's friend. You get T-shirts made of it, right? Tom is not my friend. Tom is a character that everybody knows. The funny thing is that Tom responds to you. So you'll be like, this sucks. Why can't I do this? And he'll be like, well, I thought that made more sense than this. And everybody goes, whoa, what happened? He responded. How do I deal with this? And they realized that they could actually contribute to the design and evolution of the system. When people would rally up and they'd be like, I really want this feature, they would build it. When people who started hacking into the system and they started hacking in and saying, we want to change our backgrounds, they could have cut that out, right? It was a failure of their own technology to have them be able to hack in and change the HTML. Instead, they opened it up and let it happen and said, okay, I think this is really cool what you're doing. Don't do the porn thing. Work with me. When they started actually seeing YouTube pop up and people try to put embed video in and tell stories through video, they started supporting their own video. These designers for Myspace are actually living in the culture and constantly interacting back and forth. And this is a really powerful and new opportunity for very large-scale systems. And I say large-scale. 74, earlier we heard 80 million users, right? And the key designers are still living in the site and responding to their messages. We can't say the same for most of our older, large-scale online communities. So the population sort of came in. The first group that came in was mid-late 20-year-olds, very similar to the Friendster population, except these happen to be indie rockers, mostly living in LA. Well, the thing about LA culture and indie rock culture and music culture is that music culture is this really funny thing where you keep scaling down, right? Research has sort of shown that you tend to look about 4 years ahead, and this is mostly marketing research. That people look 4 years ahead to get a sign of how they should actually interact. So who buys 17 magazine? 13-year-olds. This doesn't actually stop at teenagers, right? What do 60-year-olds do? They start trying to understand what it might be like to retire. And they start modeling off, and as you're transitioning to a new phase in life, you start looking ahead of you and trying to act like that is. Well, when it comes to music culture and early 20-somethings, the MTV stylized version, you have a bunch of 21-year-olds partying in LA and living it up and talking about the cool bars and all of this. And all of a sudden you get the 19-year-olds and the 17-year-olds and the 15-year-olds. And theoretically we're down to 14. Realistically we're down to like 8 and 9, which I don't think anybody at Myspace really wants to deal with. So people keep looking up and saying, oh, what does it mean to be a part of that generation? And they did it originally around music. So the music people ended up operating as a very powerful drawing force. So some of the original activities that promoters would go on to MySpace and say, okay, there's this really cool event that you should go to. If you're on MySpace, I'll give you access. And so people really wanted to go on MySpace. And the thing about those people is that they started drawing people in. They were like, oh, Jonathan, you've got to come to this band with me. You've got to get onto MySpace so you can come with me. And they kept pulling in their friends. And as they pulled in their friends, it's like, I know Jonathan doesn't really like, this band so much, but Jonathan wants to come hang out with me. So I can tell him about this and drag him in, and he'll join the site. And then start playing around with the site, even though he wouldn't care about the site at all. And so that kind of hub-like networking happened with the teenagers, right? The cool kids who were really tracking the music, cool 17-year-olds would come in and be like, oh, you've got to pay attention to this. And they would draw their friends in. Then they drew them in as clusters. So you get to a point where inside MySpace, you had entire social clusters where, you hear teenagers talk about, you don't exist if you're not on MySpace, right? You don't, in the same way that you hear Mimi Ito often talking about how you don't exist if you don't have a cell phone, right? Like, it's the same thing. So this is how you, keep up with the Joneses. It's how you pay attention to what's going on. And once inside, even though the music was the original draw, most people are actually not using it for music, but they're using it for all sorts of identity production purposes. Who am I? What does it mean to perform identity and to sort of write myself into being? You see these great indie rock snapshots, right? Like I'll just take a picture like this and you put it up and you perform it. There's an amazing photo difference between what goes on from the original 20-somethings who happen to be still there and the teenagers, right? The 20-somethings are going out to a crazy bar, and they take pictures of them and their friends and they throw it up to the web as a sharing function. The teenagers are taking pictures for MySpace. They're taking pictures, goofing around. They'll have MySpace parties where they gather a whole group of friends to take pictures to put on MySpace. Right? So there's this interesting moment of why identity production is so key to that period. It's also an intense socializing time and a place where, and especially in America, teens are not actually allowed that much access to physical publics. And I know some of you have heard me rant about this before. But what happens is that teens don't have the kind of publics that most of us grew up in. How many of you had something when you were growing up with go out biking, be home by dinner or by dark, right? Something like that. Were you allowed out in the neighborhood? Were people allowed to do that? Right? It's pretty normal for people, even my age. But it's pretty. I mean, where it seemed to have stopped was because the people that are about 19, 20 right now didn't have that. So that's about the cutoff point where people there was a whole paranoia, and I think I've tracked some of it down to some really crazy 2000 articles about kidnapping and 2000 news articles. All of this kidnapping and fear and all of that really hyped up in the late 90s, early 2000s, that really cemented the idea that if you sent your kid out, if they went and hung out in their neighborhood, they're going to be raped, mutilated, molested, kidnapped. It's going to be horrible. So now kids don't get to go outside. They don't have a place to go and socialize with their friends, and what they're doing is they're making that on MySpace. But what they're making on MySpace is an entirely different kind of architecture. And again, an opportunity for research questions. What are the effects of having these different kind of architectures as the kind of publics? And we had a conversation yesterday about this. What does it mean that you have persistence, searchability, copyability, and unknown audiences? The kind of things that, as Judith talked about, are very much more about celebrities, right? These are the things that celebrities normally have access to. But now teenagers are all growing up with this. They're being micro-celebrities within themselves, right? They all have their own reality television show on MySpace. And so, one of the other questions that I start to pose is we have these changes, this generation that's growing up with an entirely different kind of architecture. It may or may not change their sociability. They're trying to do the things they've always wanted to do on there, but with different costs and changes. And the question is this the world we want to live in? Do we want to keep restricting people? Because one of the things in terms of people going back to it is that just because it aligned with what teens wanted to do, it's not aligning with what parents want to do. And parents certainly want to stop it right now. There's also, we're dealing with an entirely different kind of scaling situation. What does it mean to grow up with 74 million people always having access to you and you being able to play with them at any given point? It's an entirely different scale of sociability. And so as we think about all of these building these architectures, we have to think that even as we align practices and get people to engage, what are the changes that come into play because we've changed the architecture? Thank you.